The left is always inclined to look on the grim side of things. Always inclined to look on the grim side of things. The cup is always half empty. Until you point out, look, it's half full. It doesn't look so bad.
Welcome to Political Gingervitis, the crazy and zany podcast for progressives who need a laugh. I'm your hostess with the mostest, Andrew Stewart, and this week we're going to try to put a smile on your face and maybe a few thoughts in your head.
You might have recently heard about a strange and mysterious memo delivered allegedly by an intelligence agency claiming that Donald Trump has been engaged in all sorts of unsightly and unmentionable deeds in a bedroom that was previously occupied by President Obama when he was at a hotel somewhere in the recent past. Without going too deep into the recent developments, it seems obvious to myself and to several others this is quite honestly perhaps a effort at unmaking the chance of Donald Trump becoming inaugurated as the President of the United States. Yes, we are living through a failed poo-poo coup. The fact that CNN and the rest of the establishment media is trafficking in such caca makes me wonder if next we can expect to see the CIA delivering their memos in a diaper bag and perhaps holding briefs around a pack-and-play.
Decepticons, a toast to the imminent destruction of the accursed Autobots. Energy! We won't need to conserve it after tomorrow. We can bleed this planet dry! Boy, these are good. I needed to refuel. Energy! Energy! This stuff's the greatest! Those were the good old days!
This week we have a special for you folks because I have just gotten from eBay a time tuner. That's right, a time tuner. It allows me to get in contact with somebody in the future that also has a time tuner in their vicinity and communicate with them. So I figured I would get in contact with myself in a year from now so I could find out what life is like under President Trump. I'll just turn the device on and then I will tune it properly. And now I'm going to communicate with myself. So, hello, Andrew in the future. Hello, Andrew in the past. What can you tell me about life under President Trump? It's interesting. Okay, let's start off with healthcare. What has happened in the time since Trump has taken the presidency? Well, he followed through with his promise to repeal Obamacare. Did we get universal health care? No, we got the Shriners. What? Yes, we have the Shriners. Everybody gets a voucher and they're able to go to the Shriners Hospital. And after they get their checkup, they get a 2-for-1 steak dinner and a fruit cup to go alongside their prescriptions. Lovely. Now we're going to return to the conclusion of my interview with Don DeBar, the host of CPR Metro News Radio out of New York. So, with all these things in mind, what are the points that seem the most hilarious out of all this mess? For you, at least.
One thing that I'm actually, I mean, the stakes are so high that it's hard to laugh at it. On the other hand, it's so ridiculous; it's hard not to. And one thing in particular that's ludicrous on its face is that as they have tried to construct this completely decoupled from reality narrative about what was happening in the presidential election, who represents what forces in American society, among the candidates, and all of this. And among all of the machinations, just one peek inside one particular one that gets me. The Clintons rode to power because the Republicans were so dangerous and scary that they, as most electable Democrats, even though they weren't offering much in terms of what Democrats said they wanted, could hold off the Republicans that are so terrible that this is what has to be accepted by the people in order to not face this terrible Republican, dictatorship of the crazies, Nazis, and fundamentalists. Well, this year, those very same people lined up with Hillary Clinton, and she fully embraced them in front of the Democratic Party. The assembled members of the party apparatus at the Democratic National Convention. Now, about half of the people there were repulsed by it, and they demonstrated it very clearly. It didn't make the TV cameras often, but those of us who were in the arena saw it manifest, in the form of thousands of people's bodies, milling in and out of the convention floor in protest and going back in to, occupy their seats and such. So that's one of the things that's absurd, is the fact that you had all these people that are Democratic loyalists who, if you mentioned any one of the names of people that were supporting Clinton and opposing Trump, they would be, completely angry, flip out, whatever. And yet, as they embraced Clinton, they would point to them and show that this was further evidence of the fact that we needed Clinton, and that you couldn't have Trump. That everyone agrees, including this one, this one, this one, and this one. To me, that there was a mental gyration, that had to happen to process it and have it come out that way. That I thought was absurd, like it was written by an absurdist writer.
Right. And of course, I'm looking now at a Washington Post story that I've been bringing up again and again over this last year of a fiasco, and it was August 5th, 2015, Washington Post headlined, "Donald Trump talked politics with Bill Clinton weeks before launching the 2016 bid."
I remember that.
4 Trump allies and 1 Clinton associate familiar with the exchange said Clinton encouraged Trump's efforts to play a larger role in the Republican Party and offered his own views of the political landscape. So if there's anyone who's to be held to the ultimate sort of fire for this one, it's Bill Clinton. He did this entirely on his own.
Well, you're assuming, of course, that just because the Washington Post reported it, that it happened. And I assume that did happen, by the way. Yeah. But that's a pretty dicey assumption to make, given recent history.
Yeah, I mean, five people verified it took place. So
no, I can see that it most likely did. But I'm just pointing out the irony there. But first of all, I mean, the discussion about what happened during this election focuses on the candidates as opposed to the sociological landscape. Mm-hmm. There was this. There's major sociological upheaval going on, major class-based political upheaval, basically a working class uprising that's in progress, that has manifest in a number of different ways, including inside the presidential election. You had this affected young workers who got behind Sanders and rallied and worked for him and raised money and drove him really to a victory in the primaries, although the game was rigged. That while they were referring to him as a socialist and forgetting the merits of that term with respect to Bernie Sanders, that's what they thought he was, and that was just fine with them.
Mm-hmm.
And then you had, and that now, well, then you had this uprising within the Republican Party. They essentially threw out the entire party leadership, the elite, and Trump won, saying in the process that by the time he was finished, the Republican Party was going to be remade into a workers' party.
Right.
And the agenda that lifted him, they're finally coming to at least acknowledge as a factor, was the fact that he was saying to people, I'm going to get you a job. These things that are responsible for your economic situation, the fact that you're unemployed or working for peanuts, where you and your parents had union jobs and all of that, where your kids, instead of having a free education or an affordable one, or in 5 or 6 figure debt when they get out of school and can't find a job, or that you have to decide between eating today or taking your medication. He said, I'm going to fix that.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a severe problem facing pretty much the entire working class in this country right now. So people that were Republican voters, yes, mostly white because they're Republicans, that's where this particular aspect of the working class uprising took place. They went right to that message. That's what we want. In essence, it was a left-wing program that was being advocated, although the actual details of how it would be accomplished were not given, and the hints were that they were going to try to use supply-side economics for it. The reality is Trump won't last until May or June, if that long, if he doesn't do something radical towards giving people jobs, something material in terms of result pretty quickly. And that's not going to happen with supply side. So, and I'm sure the people around him know that. So you've got those two legs of the working class standing up. And at the same time, you've had over and over in the streets, go back to Occupy in 2011, or Black Lives Matter beginning in, or I hate to use the term, it's almost like a registered trademark at this point, but the uprising in the streets over police killings and police brutality and all of that, uprisings with the Chicago teachers, with Boston bus drivers, with dock workers on the West Coast, all across the country, the $15 minimum wage. People are very active across the working class. They're being pitted against each other by primarily by the Democrats at this point in time, where the finger gets pointed to Trump as the enemy, and that he represents the unleashing of white supremacy on the rest of society. And, oh, yeah, well, some of the people that voted for him probably did it because they're stupid and believe that he's going to get them a job. But really, the rest of them is because they hate black people, Muslims, immigrants, etc. The landscape is really littered with with the contradictions that exist within the working class, and the massaging of those contradictions by the media and by primarily Democratic, but also many conventional Republican politicians. But there is a kind of consciousness that arises out of the material conditions that I think is starting to gel across those divisions. And I could see, for example, the failure of the attempted coup at the Electoral College as being a reflection, put it this way, that those who would or were about to conduct it took a look at the landscape, like back in their own districts, for example, for the electors, knowing that, you know what, this isn't going to fly because this isn't where the people are at. They want jobs. They want relief from their college tuition and their medical bills, and they want a future.
I have been looking at a lot of protests, particularly around Providence, over the last several weeks, and I certainly recognize what Jeffrey St. Clair has pointed out is the fact that Trump seems to be filling his incoming cabinet with neocons and neo-Confederates, but the ironic part is this idea that it's all just a flood of white supremacy. I give credence to the fact that the destruction of the Voting Rights Act really did have an impact in several states, But also the fact is that multiple states that were a substantial margin of victory for Obama now went as a substantial margin of victory for Trump.
Right.
And so it doesn't bear out this logic because it simply is not in the cards that everyone in the course of 4 years has joined the Klan after voting for the first African American president once, if not twice.
Right. Yeah, I agree. There's a facial contradiction there. Look, a part of the political landscape, a part of the political backdrop is this effort by Republicans to suppress votes in the black community, and some places targeting, depending on where, Hispanic community and other places where Democrats do better. Democrats have their own technology for dealing with that too. They know where Republican voters are, and they try to minimalize and de-emphasize and depress that vote to the extent possible as well.
Yeah,
these are things that need to be struggled with, and we also, and certainly they are of the highest importance for the voters who are affected, and consequently, by implication, for everybody, because if they can do it to you, they can do it to me. I, however, have been, watching as, someone awake, aware of it. I was 10 in 1964 when the Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, and all of that, 64, 65, came online. And I remember before that, people, that were on television every night fighting for voting rights for people in the South and all of that. And, it was a victory that we thought was won, and then you've seen it be chipped away at through a variety of devices, disenfranchisement for felony convictions, just outright intimidation, voter ID, a million different ways. And then, of course, there's the machines. So it almost doesn't matter who shows up to vote because the machines do the voting. And on top of that, the system itself that offers us essentially your vote can be for Trump or Clinton. And this being an unusual year, and that Trump is actually an insurgent, I believe, in the truest sense, almost never have that. So it's not a solution. It doesn't lead to a solution to keep patching this system that is itself intrinsically anti-democratic. And that's kind of what, all these things that were very important at key stages of social development in the United States, the institutions themselves are rotten from the inside out. And, arguing and fighting over reform rather than an acknowledgement of that fact and starting to build something, a new system, an alternative system that, empowers people, that has people involved in decision-making at all levels, regardless of money. If we don't get there, the rest of it is going to be which way do we die as a society, and I don't think that's the kind of discussion we ought to be having yet.
And the problem is that people don't understand exactly what is in the Federalist Papers. When you get to the heart of it, in the Federalist Papers, I believe it's Madison, makes it very clear that he and the other founders designed the Constitution intentionally to always result in what we call the duopoly. It's been designed because what happened was in the end of the 18th century, capital saw its number coming up because parliamentary democracy was beginning to become a major force on the continent and in England. And so they needed to design a system that would have essentially a preservation of the aristocratic order, but without the inbred aristocracy.
Right.
And so what they did was they created this farce of a parliamentary system and put their chits on what we call now Wall Street.
Right. That's right. It's a very simple way of describing it. I think is an effective way of describing it as well. the Constitution itself is layered with devices that were intended. I mean, on the record that people discuss it, intended to continue slavery, for example, the institution of slavery, and you could see on its face if you looked at like an electoral map in 1820 or something, for example, down south, you have a state that consists of a few dozen plantations, and you have a vote of a few dozen people, even though maybe 1 million people live in the state. The people who own the plantations vote, run for office, etc., and everyone else goes back out in the field and gets their behind to work. That was American democracy. That's the foundational American democracy. That people want to make sure that we get repair problems with suffrage and voting machines and try to take some of the money out of it. But fundamentally, the problem is that there are centers of power that have nothing to do with the government that are much larger centers of power, much greater power. You have private ownership of the economy concentrated in a few hands, ownership of the media concentrated in a few hands, control of the political levers and legal levers that pertain to elections and such that are in a few hands, control of the court system that is in essence in the control of a few hands. The rest of it is deck chairs on the Titanic. After instead of hitting an iceberg, it took like 6 torpedoes.
Exactly. And on top of that is just the pure fact that we were never intended to vote. This whole system was designed intentionally only to allow for white land-owning males, and the accident of history is that we were able, as the working class, to get literate enough to begin to demand suffrage, and the state began to cede different rights to the working class over the last 120 years as a response, due in no small part due to the Civil War. And
struggle too. Look, I don't mean to minimize any of that. Some of the the most important engine in history is human struggle.
Exactly.
And the fact that we're here having this conversation as children of the working class and are able to draw on enough history and the other relevant disciplines, philosophy, etc., to have a discussion and to share it with people around the country and around the world, reflects essentially the fruit. It's a fruit of the struggle. It's not something that was handed down. It's like, here, why don't you guys go make some trouble for us? So I don't want to de-emphasize the value of that. It's the engine of history.
Certainly.
It's the only place that our salvation as a species is going to be based there. Nevertheless, what we have to do is be smart about where we struggle when. And, the struggles that were required as a response to the material conditions that existed 100 years ago may not or even 50 years ago, may not necessarily be the same ones that are required now.
Absolutely.
And at this point in time, it appears that the system is beyond fundamental reform. And that means that either we continue and just watch things fall apart, a stronger and stronger response from the state to try to keep people in line. We're seeing with this stuff with fake news and other things, a propaganda offensive that would make Goebbels salivate if he were able to have the type of control over information that the people here have that sit on top of the pyramid. It's obvious to many people, and particularly most people outside the United States, that the existing order is crumbling and cannot be revived or stood back up on its feet. That puts on the agenda, well, first of all, it means that something else is coming and puts on the agenda the question of whether or not the working people want to be involved in crafting what comes next or just want to be victimized by it.
Certainly. And I mean, one of my challenges now is trying to articulate to particularly, ironically, leftists who want to stay wed to the old left thought processes around class and things like
the bourgeoisie versus the petite bourgeoisie versus the proletariat versus the middle class, and trying to articulate things that are brought out in the work by people like Michael Hudson, who makes very clear that those boundaries have been pushed aside by capital, and they've reformulated over the past 75 years the strategy for which they're going to use to maintain hegemony. That's a very interesting challenge.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a lot to this. I was having a conversation with someone the other day, and in the process of it, we started discussing the fact that, I think it was with Dmitry Babich, that this particular neoliberal capitalism model has learned how to both commodify and even weaponize some other competing ideologies. In particular, we were talking about fascism in Ukraine, how, liberal democracy is supposedly oppositional to fascism. They invoke the language of the 1930s and 1940s, and you see that being used as a part of the lexicon today, where, again, Trump represents, he's a proto-fascist. White supremacy is going to be, it's like riding a wave of fascism, et cetera, ignoring the fact that you have to walk around with picture ID, or you can, spend a week or two or a month on Rikers Island if you get tossed, and that there are police on the corners with machine guns, and, all things that 20 years ago might have seemed inconceivable. They don't notice that fascism in the background, but they're worried about this coming threat of fascism. Well, whatever it is, what's in Ukraine, they're actual, Nazis or Nazi sympathizers, and they were weaponized by the neoliberal elite here and set upon Ukraine. So no matter what ideology you talk about, I'm just using that one specific one, they have found ways to accommodate them and employ them. You have also what they call radical Islamic jihadism, whatever, the Salafist philosophy propagated by the Saudis and the CIA, that is also, they have no problem like sending the Air Force to help them fight a war to take over Libya, for example. Nevertheless, ideology is something that exists and motivates people, and the consciousness of people reflects the history of the ideologies that drove history to this point, thereby shaping the immediate and recent experiences of people, but also the thinking in general that helped them to acquire a way of framing what they see or what we see. The idea of class is a very valid one. It has been, the objective facts of class have evolved over time. They change like everything else in the universe. You had, at the time of Marx, the proletariat. You had the bourgeoisie, recently ascended out of the monarchies, basically, and out of the feudal system. Capitalism was born of that, and so the classes that came into existence coming out of feudalism were in one form in 1848 and are in another form now. What they have in common is the ownership and or control, but here in the West they're almost identical, of the means of production, meaning the planet itself, and others who are here at the liberty of the owners of this as available labor. When they're needed, fine. Otherwise, you get as little as we can get away with giving you. So I think there was an ideological attempt to sort of throw off the older characterizations of class and the older, maybe even definitions of class in terms of their relationship to industrial production by Occupy, by using the 1%, 99%, that no matter what it is that is the basis of a claim of the 1% to all of the assets of the planet and the denial of the use of those assets to the other 99%, we're two classes, the 1% and the 99%, and we ain't having it. That was kind of the ideological concept that came into the political lexicon of Americans as a result of Occupy. There have been all kinds of attempts, though, to obfuscate the understanding of class by the working class and by the intelligentsia. You have, for example, the Gilles, who posited that there was a new management class that had arisen in the socialist bloc, and that they were a class, blah blah blah. And there was a kernel of truth hidden inside, in my opinion, like a large pus ball, and it doesn't lead to a better understanding. This is the salient point. It doesn't lead to a solution to the problem of those who are supposedly the victims of that, but are obviously the victims of something.
Right.
What it does is obfuscate the relationship of individual groups to power.
Right.
And that's something that I think is still being worked out. But we really need to learn that fast, because the edifice is crumbling around us. The people who have benefited from this construct have command of vast resources, and so whatever is replaced, they're going to have a very strong hand in shaping. And for us to be able to express our will through that is going to require a deep understanding of what is actually happening materially, a consensus on that understanding across the class, and unity of action for essentially united demands, and the ability to govern ourselves through and after this crisis.
And now a word from our sponsors. Are you a freelance media worker who is concerned about healthcare, retirement, or making ends meet? Do you loathe the idea of returning to the daily grind but don't know what is next? Consider joining the Rhode Island Media Cooperative as a way to navigate these issues and develop a network that will support and sustain your efforts. Besides this podcast, the RIMC has been hard at work this year helping members release works that have the profits go into their pockets in totality. First is Taxi Searchers, John Wayne, Robert De Niro, and the Meaning of America by Andrew Stewart, now available on Amazon.com. If you are concerned by recent developments in American politics, take a journey with author Andrew Stewart to look for answers in the popular films of John Ford and Martin Scorsese. And coming soon,
one of our notions was that people who are politicians, and also there's a lot of politicians anyway, are people who are would be, if they had their way, be performers, would be in showbiz. But there are not as much opportunity in showbiz to be successful and make a living as there is in politics. There's all sorts of city councils, there's legislatures, there's statewide offices, governor, lieutenant governor, that kind of stuff. So basically, Buddy Cianci is a prime example. He started out, he was a kid on TV in Providence. He was on a kiddie show on TV. He's a total performer.
Cheeks Speaks, a spoken word album featuring Rhode Island's one and only Rudy Cheeks. All that and more at rimediacoop.org. That's RIMEDIACOOP.org. Now we have a real treat for you today, folks. With the recurring motif in the media that we are witnessing the rise of a fascist government, I decided to see if that were exactly the case by contacting the author of a terrific book about exactly this issue. Dr. David Abraham is the author of The Collapse of the Weimar Republic, Political Economy and Crisis. His book is a neo-Marxist analysis of the collapse of the Weimar Republic and the rise of the Nazi government. We now return to our conversation and the conclusion of the discussion with Dr. Abraham. The issue in particular that jumps out is we've had a government over the last 8 years that could be broadly described as austerity administering, whether it's because that was intentional or because of Tea Party obstructionism. Mm-hmm. That's a parallel that jumps out. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, that's a parallel that Well, okay, let's break it down. So Obama, 2008 is not an austerity candidate. I mean, there are those who want more significant deficit spending than he does, but he does nevertheless push through it during the 2 years where he had a congressional majority, a fairly serious, when compared with European governments after 2008, a fairly significant stimulus program. Now, one could argue that, given the dollar and the centrality of the U.S. and the centrality of the dollar, it's easier for the U.S. than for European countries. I can't comment on that. But it's certainly true that after 2010, it's impossible to get spending through Congress, and Obama, in a sense, stops trying after a while, and that's when we see wage stagnation and the growth of income inequality. In the late 1920s, it was a much more widely held orthodoxy that without a balanced budget, governments would not just go broke, but they would take the entire economy down with them. And Bruning, Chancellor Bruning from the Catholic Party, certainly was an incarnation of that policy, and it was disastrous. You have to remember that Keynes was not the dominant mode of public policy thinking at the time, so the idea of deficit spending was marginal. But when one looks at who it was who pushed it, it was pushed from the left, Arbeitsbeschaffungsmaßnahmen, as they called it, by a significant sector of the labor movement, trade union movement in Germany. And then, of course, the Nazis had their own way of raising and spending capital, plundering it from Jews, engaging in a bit of inflationary spending as well. So the orthodoxy was crippling, but the break from the orthodoxy occurred only at the political margins of the left and the right.
Oh, right. So there's these conflicts in the industrial sector, and the tariffs, AVI, and reparations are a major cycle engine of that, correct?
Right.
And so what were the political responses to the crisis as it was developing?
Well, I mean, I think a significant, as we said earlier, a significant section of the economic elite decided that cooperating with the Social Democrats and with the Catholic labor movement was just too expensive. They didn't want to do it anymore. The power and influence within the business and finance classes moved to the right, to the more protectionist wings of industry, and that means that no longer cooperating with Social Democrats, they no longer had a popular electoral base to turn to, and the early 30s reveals the failure and the failure of all of the kind of bourgeois, what we would call conservative parties.
Right.
They just shrink and shrink.
And parallel with that, when does it seem like the nationalist tenor of what was marginal with the Nazi press become mainstream? Is it a gradual thing? Is there a sudden jump?
I think, the Nazis did not have a monopoly on right-wing nationalist anti-Semitism at all. And the the major figure in the right-wing press, Alfred Hugenberg, was also an active leader of the German National Party. And they were the first ones to ally with the Nazis. And the press in Germany, this is one of the things about populism then and now, is the attack on mainstream press. In the case of Germany, the liberal press was often Jewish, at least in Berlin and Frankfurt, in the major press centers. And the right-wing press attacked that press, as well as advocating a very aggressive nationalist politics in general. So that was easy for the Nazis to find friends there.
All right. So there's essentially 5 different strategies that are taken up as dealing with conflicts between the agriculture and industry, correct?
Well, there are different possible outcomes, right? We know that the one that emerges is this alliance of right-wing industrial and financial interests with the populist Nazi Party, and it replaces the strategy of deficit spending, job creation, continuing an export push that would have been based on an alliance of trade unions, socialists, and the more export-driven, high capital-intensive industries.
Right. And then in 1932...
And there's another option which just doesn't have the electoral capacity, which is to try to recreate what was called the Weimar Coalition in the early 20s of socialists, Catholics, and liberal Democrats. And it doesn't work because the liberal Democrats virtually disappear as their financial and elite backers desert them, and as some of their rural voters desert them. That party, the German Democratic Party, just collapses. The Catholic Party moves to the right over the course of the 20s, and the socialists are still more than happy to be in coalition with them, but it's not enough electorally. It's not enough to run a government.
Okay. And then in 1932, ontogeny recapitulates...
that's... I wouldn't... I'm not sure I would use that language now. It's kind of cute at the time. We saw in 1 year the whole cycle of things that had taken place from 1919 to 1932. Slowly, we saw miniature versions of all in 1 year, attempts at all of those options.
And then after comes that cartelization and imperialism.
Yeah. I mean, that's the a new version of something that that many segments of German elites and business interests have looked to for a long time, namely Eastern Europe. It was the project of some very famous liberals like Max Weber and Friedrich Naumann before World War I. It was the project of the Nazis, and if you talk to a lot of unhappy members of the EU today, they'll tell you that the EU is just the latest version of German attempts to control the South and the East.
Right. And
that may be true, but there's enough differences in the way they're doing it in each of those cases that it makes a whole hell of a lot of difference to the hundreds of millions of people.
Right. And what kind of attitudes have you seen, if you've seen any regarding that within that issue within the German public today.
I mean, in regard to the EU.
Yeah.
Well, I think the German public there is quite divided as between those who think that the EU is the best and most natural way for Germany to continue as a liberal democratic and rich country. There are others who think that German taxpayers are footing the bill for lazy Greeks and incompetent Sicilians and clueless Spaniards, and all the stereotypes come into play. But I think, given what we've seen in Poland, Hungary, France, close call in Austria, and who knows who's next, that the many folks in Europe see Germany as a kind of the machine of globalization. At the same time that a lot of Germans see globalization as a threat themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Globalization as a threat.
And do you see any parallels in the attitudes about this cartelization and imperialism from back in the Weimar days within America, because of how much, say, the military eats up and devours it?
Yeah, I mean that's an unspoken subject in American politics. I mean, even Bernie Sanders, whatever he might have thought, did not think it plausible to say, in answer to the question, how are you going to pay for all this stuff, that we in the U.S. have this enormously inflated military operation going,
mm-hmm.
and that we could easily cut it by X%, which would go a long way to national health or student debt relief or any number of other things that he advocated. But you can't touch it, and he didn't. Even he didn't. Not to mention that Clinton and the mainstream of the party never would even think about it.
Right. But interestingly, it was Trump who did tease this out. And in another interview, I had someone say to me, he's basically reduced American imperialism down to a monetary thing and an equation and said, you're going to pay.
Yeah, so I guess we will see whether he's thinking one of two things. One, Putin and the Chinese are entitled to their spheres of influence. We are entitled to ours. We can recognize each other's legitimate areas of influence. Hence, Trump is probably ready to accept that the Crimea and eastern Ukraine, or all of Ukraine, belong in Russia's sphere of influence, and might be willing, I don't know about the Japanese, but might certainly be willing to tell the Filipinos, go do what you said Obama should do, you go do it yourself. And he could still spend a lot of money on the military, on toys, but not on sending working class kids to Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria. And I think, he got quite a few of his votes from people who did think that Clinton was trigger happy.
Mm. And you talk of the re-emergence of the labor/capital conflict in...
Right. Yeah, so the welfare state papers over or provides a temporary solution to the bitter class conflicts that produced revolution and war in the streets in 1918, 1919. But it costs money. And at excuse me, at some point that one can date to specific events like the Ruhr Valley Iron and Steel Conflict of 1928 or 1930, one can discuss exactly what the chronology should be, but the economic elite of Germany decided we're not paying for this anymore. And the Social Democrats couldn't live without it. I mean, they could not live without being in a government that had policies that satisfied needs of their working class.
Okay. And so they begin to implement industry's program as a result.
Yeah, the dismantling of the welfare state.
And this, of course, leads to the search for a viable political bloc, correct?
Right, that can support those kinds of policies. So in the United States, we also saw the beginning of the takedown of the American welfare state in the guise of the fiscal crisis starting in 1973.
Mm-hmm.
And it's always, where's the money supposed to come from to pay for all of this welfareism? And that's always the challenge that opponents of the welfare state raise. And in the case of the United States, that battle was conducted around the issue of taxation.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And Reagan was very successful, as was Thatcher in England, working that vein. In Germany, it was partly constructed around the issue of taxation, but it was also more directly around wages and strikes and benefits and welfare state programs.
Right.
That's where the rubber hit the road.
And so this results in the rise of the Nazi Party.
Well, the Nazi Party's rise takes place at this time.
Mm-hmm.
The causation is not as direct as what you just suggested.
Okay.
I mean, the declining welfare state is something that agitates a lot of people, including many who go on to vote for the Nazis. The attack on the welfare state comes from above initially, and then Nazi voters are mobilized not in the name of ending the welfare state. Nazis don't do that. They are, after all, the National Socialist German Workers' Party. And so they don't attack the wages of German workers or the welfare state. They attack people who don't deserve what they're getting. Jews, communists, people aren't really part of the us. And their mobilization is much more social and cultural than it is immediately economic.
Okay. One element that this might not be specific to your work, and if you want to pass, that's fine, but part of this issue we saw with Clinton and the trigger finger has been encroachment and surrounding Russia. And there's many who parallel our hawkish nature towards Russia with the behavior that the Nazis had in government towards the Soviet Union.
Well, the Cold War started in 1917, and I don't know that it has ever ended. The Soviet Union is over, and in some ways, Russia is seeking, if not a socialist economy, it's certainly seeking to retain the great power status that the Soviet Union achieved for itself.
Mm-hmm.
And that puts it in an adversarial position with the United States. And then the end of the Soviet Union allowed both liberal and conservative Americans to say, don't people deserve democracy and freedom? And Russia's backward, anti-democratic country. We're going to support people who strive for freedom and who are afraid under the shadow of Russia, and we're going to encourage them. So the role of the United States in the Maidan, in the Ukrainian events, was to cause trouble for Russia. And the hint that the Ukraine might be invited to join NATO at some point, or certainly the EU, the Russians saw as a distinct infringement on their rightful sphere of influence. Nazi Germany saw a lot more. They saw a lot of territory in Eastern Europe and a breadbasket in the Ukraine, and they saw territories they could pillage and depopulate and recolonize with Germans. And it was a much insanely bigger project than attempting to box Russia in the current project.
Right. What are your feelings about the Islamophobia that's really become rampant worldwide since 9/11 and the stuff we've seen and saw from Germany at that time?
Yeah, so, I mean, there are always similarities when you try to draw lines that exclude people by definition, whether they are very middle-class Jews who've been living in Germany for centuries, or poorer Jews who come from Eastern Europe in the last generation or two, or Muslim immigrants of recent years in Europe. But the fear that Islamic migration is going to destroy some romanticized vision of our culture, our European culture, is worrisome. I don't think it has the potential to lead to the kinds of violations of basic legal and constitutional equality that we saw in fascist, Nazi and fascist policies. I think we may see, well, we've already seen the refusal of a lot of European states to accept immigrants or refugees, partly on the grounds that they're not Christian and of an alien and scary culture, and that has fused with the security and terrorism question. That's right. I think there's some similarities, but I would not go into panic mode on that.
Okay.
That's all we got for the time for today, folks. Thanks for listening, and tune in next time for another episode of Political Gingervitis. I'm your host, Andrew Stewart, and I want to remind you again, America's greatest social democratic period corresponded with the lives of those wonderful commies, Larry, Curly, and Moe.